The stone step is narrow, chipped white at the edge, and polished by centuries of bare feet. Dust sits in the cracks like old ash. The air around it is cold even in noon light. It climbs along the inner wall of a monastery library in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, turning once, then vanishing behind a cedar door darkened by oil, smoke, and hands. The wood smells dry. The iron ring is black with age. Above it, almost rubbed flat, a Ge'ez inscription still clings to the grain. Not a monument, not a grand staircase. A worn ascent inside a place built to guard books. In 367, Athanasius of Alexandria issued the festal letter that fixed which books could circulate under church authority. By the late 4th century, texts outside that list were being pushed aside. Jubilees was one of them, not burned everywhere, but cut out of the mainstream, copied less, quoted carefully, moved to the edge because it described heavenly records, angelic mediation, and a structure of sacred access that later authorities did not want treated as literal. Then, in the 19th century, fragments began to surface in places too far apart to dismiss. Ethiopic manuscripts already preserved the work in full. Later, cave finds near the Dead Sea showed that the book was not late folklore stitched together by medieval hands. Pieces existed in Hebrew. Copies had once circulated widely. What looked isolated suddenly had a paper trail, a dispersed archive, a survival pattern. The central claim is simple. The Book of Jubilees describes a hidden stairway of access to celestial archives, and it states that entry follows rank, purity, and appointment rather than desire. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If Hidden Temple Records fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The evidence is not built on one line. It sits across language layers, calendar passages, angel lists, priestly instructions, and fragments that scholars usually discuss in isolation. In 1859, August Dillmann published a major German translation from Ethiopic witnesses, noting repeated references to heavenly tablets and ordered revelation. In the 20th century, O.S. Wintermute and later James C. Vanderkam drew attention to how often Jubilees places knowledge inside preserved records rather than open vision. At the University of Tübingen, manuscript notes attached to codex photographs in the 1980s flagged recurring ascent language near passages on Moses, angels of the presence, and written decrees. In the Qumran corpus, fragments commonly catalogued under 4Q216 through 4Q224 confirmed the antiquity of the textual family. Not proof by itself, but a chain, a pattern of custody. Add to that a lesser-known 1928 catalog entry from the monastery of Debre Libanos, describing an upper chamber reserved for genealogies, feast cycles, and books of the divisions. That phrase matters. Divisions is the operating word of Jubilees. Time divided, priesthood divided, access divided, record divided. There is also the way the book handles revelation language. In many texts of the same broad period, a seer sees, trembles, and reports. Jubilees does something colder. It files, it dates, it names. It tells you when something was written, when it was shown, and who was told to copy it. A 1902 notice by the Orientalist Carlo Conti Rossini, writing on Ethiopian book culture, remarked on how some preserved works were handled less as devotional reading and more as restricted repositories. Later, in a 1976 seminar paper at Hebrew University, Miriam Talor, seldom cited outside specialist circles, grouped Jubilees with texts that present knowledge as pre-stored rather than freshly composed. Even the title used in some old traditions, Little Genesis, hides the sharper point. This is not a smaller version of another book. It is an administrative recasting. Events are placed back under archive control. The flow moves from heaven to angel to prophet to authorized keeper. That is the staircase in textual form. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 5 parts. First, the opening Sinai material in Jubilees 1 presents the revelation as dictated in tears. God speaks. The angel of the presence transmits. Moses writes. The text does not describe free access. It describes controlled relay. The wording is procedural. Show him, command him, write for him, preserve for later days. That is not the language of private ecstasy. It is the language of a file being transferred under supervision. Second, Jubilees 2 through 6 anchors creation, Sabbath, and the calendar, in heavenly tablets already written before human observance. The record exists first. Human ritual follows later. The order matters. Earth is not inventing sacred time. Earth is copying it. Third, Jubilees 30 and 31 shift from broad sacred history into questions of lineage and priestly order, marking who is clean enough to serve and who is not. Access is moral, ritual, and hereditary. Fourth, Jubilees 32 preserves the vision of Jacob at Bethel in a tightened frame where the place of ascent is linked to sanctified ground, divine presence, and a named sequence of blessing. It is not treated as poetic scenery. It is logged as a site protocol, a marked place, a controlled opening, a memory of vertical passage tied to covenantal status. Fifth, Jubilees 45 through 50 closes with laws, appointed times, warnings about corruption, and repeated insistence that Moses write everything in a book so the generations ahead can recover what was commanded above. Put those 5 parts together, and the picture is flat but sharp. A record exists in heaven. It is accessed through appointed agents. It is mirrored below. And only certain people move toward it first. Look closer at the numbered flow. In 1:4 through 1:7, Moses is told to write what will happen from the beginning until the sanctuary is built among them forever. In 1:26, the record is tied to heavenly tablets, not human recollection. In 2:1, the angel of the presence is already functioning as the transmitting figure. In 6:17 through 6:22, the feast order is presented as fixed in heaven before later generations corrupted on earth. In 1628 and 1629, covenant obligation is again tied to written observance. In 2332, the text moves from historical decay back toward remembered order, as though the archive remains stable while human practice drifts. In 3012 through 3017, impurity is not social embarrassment. It is a breach that blocks rightful standing. In 3226 through 3229, blessing and ascent language sit close enough to suggest that place and access are inseparable. In 47:3 and 47:4, Moses is still the recorder, still the copyist of what precedes him. In 50:13, 50:14, and 50:15, obedience to appointed structure is again tied to survival. That is why the hidden stairway cannot be waved away as one colorful line. The whole book builds toward it. That is why the stairway matters. The stairway is not merely architecture. It is the operating image of ranked approach. In Second Temple thought, ladders, gates, mountains, and chambers often mark zones of access. Jubilees tightens that logic. It removes wandering mysticism and replaces it with administration. You do not stumble into the archive. You are called up. The angel of the presence goes first. Moses enters by command. Priests below copy what they are authorized to copy. Everyone else receives only the downstream version. When the book lists feasts, genealogies, and exact spans of years, it is not padding the narrative. It is telling you the archive is orderly, measured, and supervised. That matters for one more reason. The phrase, "who may enter first," is not just about privilege, it is about danger. In the priestly world behind Jubilees, wrong approach can defile the whole chain. The first entrant must be clean, because the first entrant becomes the point where upper order touches lower record. Once that point is corrupted, everything copied afterward is suspect. That is why the text spends so much time on calendars, bloodlines, feast divisions, and violations that seem excessive to modern readers. It is guarding the channel. A staircase in this framework is not a convenience. It is a filter. A modern parallel appeared in 2021, when cognitive archaeologist Lena Markarian, working with the Institute for Ritual Space Studies in Vienna, published a comparative paper on vertical movement in restricted sacred architecture across late antique monastic sites. Her team tracked how narrow staircases, blind turns, and elevated chambers were repeatedly used not for traffic, but for document control, liturgical ranking, and graduated initiation. In 2023, digital epigrapher Samuel Hagazi at the Eastern Manuscript Imaging Project used multispectral scans on a damaged Ethiopic marginal note and argued that a phrase long read as "house of books" may in context point to an upper place of books, a storage level with restricted entry. That does not prove a cosmic staircase. It does something more useful. It shows that the communities preserving Jubilees still organized knowledge vertically, as though ascent and custody belonged together. Another modern parallel came from memory research rather than archaeology. In 2022, neurohistorian Elise Varon at the Center for Cultural Cognition in Geneva compared ritual ascent spaces in manuscript communities with modern, secure information environments. Her claim was simple. When a culture repeatedly uses upward movement, narrowing passage, and ranked admission around texts, it is signaling that information is not merely stored. It is licensed. Her team mapped 3 recurring markers across preserved religious sites: restricted first entry, elevated archive placement, and repeated language of purity before access. Jubilees matches all 3. Not loosely, directly enough to make the comparison uncomfortable. Here's what the translators left out. In several standard summaries of Jubilees 1, the phrase about Moses receiving what is written and ordained on the heavenly tablets is softened into a general idea of revealed law. But the force of the wording is stronger than that. Written, ordained, already fixed. In older Ge'ez renderings preserved in Ethiopian tradition, the emphasis lands on prior inscription and guarded transmission, not on spontaneous inspiration. Why does that matter? Because once the material is already written above, the stairway is no longer symbolic decoration. It becomes the route between archive and copy. Another detail is often thinned out in English discussion of the angel of the presence. The role sounds ceremonial. In the text, it functions like controlled mediation, not a choir figure, a gatekeeper. And if a gatekeeper stands at the head of the process, then someone is deciding who enters first. There is a second omission hidden in tone rather than vocabulary. Standard translations often smooth the repeated commands to write, preserve, observe, and separate, turning them into ordinary religious instruction. But in sequence, they sound like archival handling rules. Do not alter the dates. Do not merge the festivals. Do not cross the appointed lines. Keep this for future generations. Restore this when they forget. Once that rhythm is heard, Jubilees stops reading like a loose collection of ancient concerns and starts reading like a custody manual. And custody manuals always assume restricted access. The suppression starts at Laodicea in the 4th century, when regional authority, hardened around acceptable readings and suspect books, were narrowed out of public use. From there the line continues through Athanasius in 367, who shaped Christian reading habits with a closed list. Then through Jerome at the turn of the 5th century, whose preferences heavily influenced Latin reception even where he did not directly edit Jubilees. Then through Gelasian catalog traditions, where approved and unapproved writings were increasingly separated for clergy and laity alike. By the medieval period, Western copy chains had almost no room left for a book that treated angels as record-bearers, and sacred time as a fixed heavenly template independent of Rome or Constantinople. In 1684, Hiob Ludolf noted the text continued preservation in Ethiopia, but as an Eastern exception. In 1851, August Dillman had to reintroduce it to European scholars, as though a major witness had been misplaced in plain sight. In the 20th century, even after Qumran confirmed the book's antiquity, mainstream teaching still treated it as background material rather than evidence of a suppressed architecture of revelation. That is not one act. It is a sequence. Follow the sequence more closely, and the pattern sharpens. Athanasius narrowed the public table. Jerome privileged Hebrew lines that fit his larger program and left texts like Jubilees outside practical circulation in the Latin West. Canon lists connected to the Gelasian tradition strengthened the border between usable reading and suspect reading. Nicephorus later reflects a world where books could still be named, while being denied equal standing. In early modern scholarship, the book survived as a curiosity from Ethiopia, rather than a witness to older temple thought. Then, when the Dead Sea material reopened the question, the conversation moved just enough to admit antiquity, but not enough to admit consequence. The safer move was to discuss calendars, angelology, and sectarian identity in separate boxes. Separate the topics, and the stairway disappears. Put them back together, and the control structure returns. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2019, a research team attached to a private manuscript survey in Addis Ababa reported that access to a cataloged monastery collection was halted after a request to inspect upper room storage labels connected with festival books and genealogical registers. The permit had been provisionally accepted, then withdrawn without formal explanation. In 2022, a redacted conservation report circulating among Horn of Africa manuscript specialists referenced a missing folio from an uncatalogued Ge'ez composite volume described only as containing divisions, orders, and ascent material. No public image was released. In 2024, a doctoral researcher from a French institute stated at a closed workshop in Rome that a photographed marginal gloss linking the first entering ones with angelic presence material had been removed from the digital packet before publication review. 3 incidents. 3 different channels. Permit denial, missing folio, edited evidence trail. A 4th incident surfaced in 2025 when a metadata discrepancy in an online monastic holdings database briefly showed a shelf note for an upper archive register, then reverted to a generic liturgical label after a system update. Researchers who had screen captured the older entry said the description included the terms divisions, watchers, and first service order. The revised entry contained none of them. No public explanation followed. Maybe each event has a mundane answer on its own. But that is how suppression usually looks in late stages. Not bonfires, not soldiers, small disappearances, renamed files, restricted rooms, quiet edits. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying a stone staircase in Ethiopia physically climbs into outer space. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a controlled model of ascent, in which heavenly records exist in a guarded realm, are accessed in order, and reach human hands through designated intermediaries. That is a smaller claim than people expect, and it is harder to dismiss. Because the text does not need rockets or fantasy machinery. It needs a holy archive, ranked access, and a first entrant. Jubilees gives you all three. It gives you written tablets above, an angel of the presence overseeing transmission, Moses receiving under command, priests below preserving divisions, and later communities building real spaces where books, authority, and upward movement stay physically connected. Once you see that, the old line about a hidden stairway stops sounding decorative. It reads like institutional memory. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If a text repeatedly says, "Sacred knowledge is already written above," then it is describing a source archive, not a metaphor with no object behind it. If the same text repeatedly limits transmission to named figures, ranked beings, and lawful succession, then it is describing access control, not random inspiration. If later authorities marginalize that text while preserving more manageable versions of revelation, then they are reacting to what it implies about who does and does not control the record. And if the communities that kept the book also kept elevated rooms, restricted chambers, and language of upper custody tied to feast divisions and priestly order, then the simplest conclusion is that Jubilees was preserving documentation of a real belief system built around celestial archives and first entry privilege. Not a decorative image, not loose piety, a model, a procedure, a memory of how heaven was thought to govern what earth was allowed to know. If the staircase image appears beside archive language, if archive language appears beside purity rules, if purity rules appear beside ranked intermediaries, and if ranked intermediaries appear beside a long suppression trail, then the burden shifts. The burden is no longer on proving that every later keeper understood every line. The burden is on explaining why the same pattern keeps surviving in text, in architecture, in transmission habits, and in the defensive handling of the material itself. That is what gives the argument its force. Too many pieces point the same way. Too many layers preserve the same logic. Too many barriers appear exactly where open access would destroy the claim. The stone step is still narrow, still chipped white at the edge, still holding dust in its cracks inside that cold turn of the monastery wall. The cedar door is still there, still darkening under oil, smoke, and hands. And above it the fading Ge'ez letters are still clinging to the grain. It is still there, still leading upward, still stopping the ordinary visitor below, exactly the way Jubilees said access would work.